A routine flight turns into a nightmare when both pilots fall unconscious at 37,000 feet. As panic spreads through the cabin and the cockpit goes silent, a quiet child suddenly runs toward the locked door, revealing hidden knowledge that becomes everyone's only chance at survival. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. The morning sun streamed through the terminal windows at Denver International Airport as passengers shuffled through Gate 37, their conversations blending into the familiar symphony of commercial aviation. Flight 782 to Seattle represented nothing remarkable in the vast choreography of daily flights crisscrossing North America, just another Boeing 737 preparing for another routine journey that thousands of similar aircraft completed without incident every single day. Business travelers tapped urgently on laptops while balancing coffee cups, families wrestled with carry-on luggage and restless children, and flight attendants stood at the gate entrance with practiced smiles that welcomed everyone aboard with the professional warmth that defined their training. The gate agent's voice crackled through the speaker system announcing boarding for Zone 3, and passengers surged forward with their boarding passes extended like tickets to an unremarkable theater performance where nothing unexpected ever happened. Sarah Mitchell, lead flight attendant for Flight 782, greeted passengers at the aircraft door with the same cheerful professionalism she had perfected over 12 years with the airline. She watched as a steady stream of travelers made their way down the narrow aisle, stuffing bags into overhead compartments and settling into seats with the weary resignation of people who had made this journey too many times to find any excitement in the process. A young couple in row 12 discussed their Seattle vacation plans, their voices bright with anticipation about visiting the Space Needle and Pike Place Market. An elderly man in row 8 immediately reclined his seat and closed his eyes, clearly planning to sleep through the entire 2-hour flight. 3 businessmen in the exit row argued about quarterly projections and market share while simultaneously checking email on their phones until the final boarding announcement required them to switch to airplane mode. Everything unfolded exactly as it had on thousands of previous flights, with the predictable rhythm that made commercial aviation both remarkably safe and thoroughly mundane. Among the boarding passengers, a 12-year-old girl named Emma Harrison made her way quietly to seat 15A, a window seat toward the rear of the aircraft where she settled in with minimal fuss. She wore jeans and a plain blue hoodie, her brown hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, and carried a small backpack that she tucked beneath the seat in front of her with practiced efficiency. Emma traveled alone as an unaccompanied minor, a fact that prompted Sarah to stop by her seat with the extra attention that airline policy required for young solo travelers. The girl looked up with calm brown eyes that seemed older than her years and assured the flight attendant that she was fine, that she had made this trip between Denver and Seattle many times to visit her grandmother, and that she knew all the procedures for unaccompanied minors. Sarah noted the maturity in Emma's demeanor and marked her mentally as one of those rare young travelers who required minimal supervision, the kind of self-sufficient child who probably spent most flights reading or doing homework without causing any disturbance whatsoever. What Sarah could not possibly know, what no one aboard Flight 782 could possibly guess, was that Emma Harrison possessed aviation knowledge far exceeding that of most adults who flew regularly. Her parents had both been commercial pilots for major airlines, her father a captain with 20 years of experience and her mother a first officer who had flown everything from regional jets to wide-body internationals. They had died together 2 years earlier when their private Cessna encountered unexpected severe weather during a weekend flight, a tragedy that had left Emma orphaned and living with her grandmother in Seattle. But before that terrible day, they had shared their passion for aviation with their daughter in ways that went far beyond casual conversation. From the time Emma could read, her parents had walked her through flight manuals, explaining aerodynamics and navigation and emergency procedures with the same care other parents devoted to bedtime stories. Her father had built a sophisticated flight simulator in their basement, a setup with actual aircraft controls and multiple monitors that recreated the Boeing 737 cockpit with remarkable accuracy, and Emma had spent countless hours there learning to fly under her parents' careful instruction. After their deaths, aviation became Emma's connection to the parents she missed desperately, and she had thrown herself into studying everything they had taught her and much more besides. She memorized FAA regulations and emergency checklists, studied weather patterns and aircraft systems, and spent hours on flight simulation software that her parents' pilot friends had given her. She watched cockpit videos and read accident investigation reports, absorbing technical details that most professional pilots never encountered unless they were airline instructors or accident investigators. Her grandmother worried that this obsession was unhealthy, that Emma should be focused on normal 12-year-old interests like social media and school friends rather than drowning herself in the world that had taken her parents. But Emma found comfort in the precise technical language of aviation, in the orderly procedures that governed every aspect of flight operations, in the sense that understanding how aircraft worked somehow kept her parents' memory alive in ways that photo albums and home videos could not. Now Emma sat in seat 15A pulling a tablet from her backpack while other passengers continued boarding around her with their casual conversations about weekend plans and business meetings. She opened a flight tracking app that showed Flight 782's planned route to Seattle, studying the waypoints and airways they would follow as the aircraft climbed to cruising altitude. She knew they would likely fly at 37,000 feet today given the weather patterns and traffic flow, following a standard routing that would take them northwest across Wyoming and Montana before descending into Seattle from the east. None of the passengers glancing at her screen would recognize what they were seeing as anything more than some kind of game or entertainment app, just another child absorbed in digital distraction during a flight. They certainly would not realize that this quiet girl in the window seat could read aeronautical charts and understood the difference between IFR and VFR operations, or that she had memorized the emergency checklists for dual engine failure, explosive decompression, and electrical system malfunctions. In the cockpit of Flight 782, Captain James Reynolds and First Officer David Chin completed their pre-flight checklist with the efficient coordination of a crew that had flown together many times before. Captain Reynolds was a 28-year veteran with the airline, a calm professional known for his meticulous approach to procedures and his ability to handle any situation with unflappable competence. First Officer Chen had 8 years with the company and was building flight hours toward his own upgrade to captain, learning from Reynolds' experience while bringing his own careful attention to detail to every flight. They reviewed the weather briefing showing clear skies along their entire route with only light turbulence possible over the Rockies, checked the aircraft's fuel load and weight distribution, and confirmed that all systems showed normal indications on the overhead panel and main instrument displays. Everything about Flight 782's preparation reflected the exacting standards that made commercial aviation the safest form of transportation ever devised, with multiple redundant systems and carefully trained crews following procedures refined through decades of operational experience. The cabin door closed precisely on schedule and Sarah began the safety demonstration while passengers paid varying degrees of attention, most having seen this presentation hundreds of times and viewing it as merely the ritual that preceded takeoff. Emma watched carefully despite having memorized every word, her eyes tracking Sarah's hand movements as she indicated emergency exits and demonstrated the use of oxygen masks and flotation devices. She knew that most passengers ignored these demonstrations despite their critical importance, that people had died in survivable accidents simply because they had not paid attention to basic safety information. Her parents had taught her that the most dangerous attitude in aviation was complacency, the belief that because something happened routinely it could not go wrong, and Emma had internalized that lesson in ways that shaped her entire worldview. She watched Sarah point out the emergency exits and mentally noted their locations, calculating the number of rows she would need to traverse in darkness or smoke to reach the nearest exit from her seat. Flight 782 pushed back from the gate at exactly 9:15 in the morning and taxied toward runway 34 or behind a procession of other departing aircraft. Captain Reynolds followed the ground controller's instructions with practiced precision, guiding the Boeing 737 along the taxiway system while completing additional checklists and configuring the aircraft for takeoff. The engine spooled up to full power and the aircraft accelerated down the runway with the familiar rumble and vibration that passengers barely noticed anymore, climbing smoothly into the clear Colorado morning with Denver's sprawling metropolitan area spreading below them. First Officer Chen called out airspeeds and checked that all systems showed normal indications while Captain Reynolds hand flew the initial departure before engaging the autopilot once they reached 10,000 feet. The flight deck routine unfolded with the clockwork precision that characterized every commercial flight, two professional pilots managing complex systems while following procedures designed to handle any conceivable situation that might arise. The Boeing 737 climbed steadily through 20,000 feet and then 30,000 as it tracked northwest toward Wyoming, and Sarah began the beverage service with her fellow flight attendants pushing carts down the narrow aisles. Passengers accepted coffee and soft drinks while reading magazines or working on laptops, their conversations covering the mundane topics that filled every flight. Emma declined the offered beverage and continued studying her tablet, switching between her flight tracking app and a document containing Boeing 737 emergency procedures that she had compiled from various sources. To any casual observer she appeared to be just another child absorbed in schoolwork or games, certainly not someone memorizing the steps required to restart an engine in flight or conduct an emergency descent. She glanced occasionally out the window at the rugged mountains passing below, recognizing landmarks from the many times she had made this flight and calculating their position relative to the route she had reviewed before boarding. In the cockpit, Captain Reynolds and First Officer Chen had settled into the routine monitoring of cruise flight, watching instruments that showed all systems operating normally while the autopilot flew the programmed route with precision. They discussed the weather ahead and reviewed the arrival procedures they would use when approaching Seattle, maintaining the professional focus that never completely relaxed even during the quiet portions of a flight. The Boeing 737 droned northwest at 37,000 feet with the Rocky Mountains' dramatic peaks gradually giving way to the flatter terrain of Wyoming, just another aircraft among thousands cruising at high altitude across North America on this ordinary Tuesday morning. Everything about Flight 782 remained utterly routine, completely unremarkable, exactly the kind of uneventful flight that passengers expected and that crews completed countless times throughout their careers without any incident worth mentioning in their logbooks. What neither pilot noticed immediately was the subtle change in the air circulation system, an almost imperceptible shift that began when a defective valve in the bleed air system started allowing contaminated air to enter the cockpit ventilation. The aircraft's environmental control system drew air from the engine's compressor sections, air that normally passed through filters and heat exchangers before circulating through the cabin. But a series of small maintenance oversights had allowed engine oil to contaminate the bleed air system during the previous flight, and when a seal degraded during Flight 782's climb to altitude, that contaminated air began flowing directly into the cockpit. The smell was faint at first, barely noticeable as a slightly acrid odor that both pilots registered subconsciously but did not immediately recognize as dangerous. Commercial aircraft had experienced bleed air contamination incidents many times before, events that usually resulted in crews donning oxygen masks and conducting emergency descents, but occasionally the contamination included substances that could rapidly incapacitate crew members before they recognized the threat. The words tumbled out of Emma in a rush as she explained that both her parents had been airline pilots, that they had taught her to fly before they died, that she had thousands of hours on a Boeing 737 simulator and knew the emergency procedures by heart. Sarah stared at the young girl in disbelief, her mind struggling to process what she was hearing because it seemed impossible that this child could possess the knowledge and skills necessary to save them. But Emma did not wait for permission or debate, instead rattling off technical specifications and emergency procedures with a speed and accuracy that no one could fake. She described the exact layout of the 737 cockpit, the function of every switch and display, the sequence of actions required to manually unlock the cockpit door from outside using the emergency access panel hidden behind a concealed cover near the door frame. She explained that if both pilots were unconscious they needed to get oxygen flowing immediately and that she could talk them through the process if someone could get the door open. Sarah made a decision based purely on instinct and desperation, recognizing that even if this child only possessed 10% of the knowledge she claimed, it was infinitely more than anyone else aboard could offer. She followed Emma's instructions to locate the emergency access panel, removing the small cover to reveal a mechanical override that could unlock the cockpit door in situations where the electronic system failed. Emma talked her through the precise sequence of actions required to activate the override, demonstrating knowledge of security systems that airlines carefully guarded, and after several tense seconds the heavy cockpit door clicked open. Sarah pulled it wide and both she and Emma stopped in horror at the sight of Captain Reynolds and First Officer Chen slumped unconscious in their seats, the cockpit instrument panels glowing with warning lights that indicated multiple system alerts that no one had addressed. Emma pushed past Sarah and stepped into the cockpit with her heart hammering so hard she could hear it in her ears, forcing herself to focus on the procedures her parents had drilled into her rather than succumbing to the terror that threatened to paralyze her completely. She saw immediately that both pilots were still breathing, their chests rising and falling regularly even though they showed no response to voice or touch. Sarah tried to shake Captain Reynolds awake without success while Emma scanned the overhead panel looking for the source of the contamination, her eyes finding the bleed air system controls and immediately recognizing the pattern of switch positions that indicated a bleed air fault. She reached up and shut off the contaminated bleed air sources exactly as the emergency checklist required, then grabbed the oxygen masks from their storage positions above each pilot's seat and placed them over Reynolds and Chen's faces, twisting the knobs to activate emergency oxygen flow. Sarah watched in stunned amazement as this 12-year-old girl moved through the cockpit with purpose and precision, reaching for controls and reading instruments with an expertise that seemed utterly impossible given her age. Emma's hands flew across the overhead panel checking circuit breakers and system status indicators while she explained in rapid-fire technical language that they had experienced a bleed air contamination event, that both pilots had been poisoned by fumes from the air circulation system, and that they might remain unconscious for an unknown period depending on what specific contaminants they had inhaled. She said they needed to establish communication with air traffic control immediately and request emergency assistance, that the aircraft could continue flying on autopilot but would need active crew intervention to navigate around weather or avoid traffic conflicts. Emma dropped into the captain's seat without hesitation, her small frame barely filling the space designed for adult pilots, and reached for the radio control panel with hands that shook slightly despite her outward confidence. Emma keyed the radio microphone using the technique her father had taught her, speaking clearly and calmly despite the adrenaline flooding her system. She transmitted on the frequency displayed on the radio panel, identifying the aircraft as Flight 782 and declaring an emergency due to pilot incapacitation, her young voice sounding surreal coming over aviation radio frequencies normally reserved for professional crews. The air traffic controller in Salt Lake Center responded immediately, his voice sharp with concern as he asked Emma to confirm that both pilots were incapacitated and that a child was now operating the radio. Emma confirmed the situation and explained her background as briefly as possible, stating that she had extensive simulator experience and knowledge of Boeing 737 systems but had never actually flown a real aircraft. The controller's voice reflected his shock at the situation but he maintained professional composure and told Emma to stand by while he notified his supervisor and began coordinating emergency response procedures. In the cabin behind her, passengers had begun to understand that a young girl was now their only hope of survival, and reactions ranged from denial to terror to a strange sort of calm acceptance that their fate now rested in the hands of someone barely past childhood. Sarah made an announcement explaining that they had a very unusual situation but that the young passenger helping in the cockpit had genuine aviation knowledge and they needed everyone to remain calm and follow all instructions. She asked if there was anyone aboard with any pilot experience whatsoever who might be able to assist, and this time a man in row 6 identified himself as a private pilot with about 200 hours of experience in small single-engine aircraft. Sarah rushed him forward to the cockpit where Emma glanced at him briefly before asking if he had any glass cockpit or autopilot experience, and when he admitted that all his flying had been in basic aircraft with minimal avionics, Emma made the difficult decision that his help would likely cause more harm than good in the complex environment of a modern jet transport. The Salt Lake Center controller came back on frequency and connected Emma to a supervisor who had aviation emergency experience, and that supervisor's first instruction was to ensure that the aircraft remained stable and that Emma should not attempt to disconnect the autopilot or manually fly unless absolutely necessary. Emma acknowledged the instruction and confirmed that the autopilot was engaged and functioning normally, that all flight instruments showed proper indications, and that the aircraft was maintaining its assigned altitude and route. The supervisor told her they were immediately contacting the airline and would be putting her in touch with a senior 737 captain who could provide guidance, and that emergency crews were being alerted at every airport along their route in case they needed to conduct an emergency landing. Emma felt a wave of relief at knowing she would have expert help, that she would not have to make these decisions completely alone, but she also understood that until the incapacitated pilots woke up she was the only person aboard with any realistic chance of safely landing Flight 782. Over the next 10 minutes while waiting for the airline captain to reach an air traffic control facility with appropriate radio equipment, Emma conducted a complete assessment of the aircraft's status with Sarah reading her instrument indications and switch positions at her direction. They determined that fuel state was adequate for at least 3 more hours of flight, that all engines and hydraulic systems showed normal operation, and that the flight control computers were managing the autopilot without any anomalies. Emma checked the flight plan loaded in the flight management computer and saw that they were currently over western Montana, still tracking towards Seattle, though she knew that weather or other factors might require deviations from that planned route. She also knew that eventually she would need to program the computers to conduct an approach and landing at whatever airport they selected, a complex task that required knowledge of procedures she had only practiced in simulation, never in an actual aircraft where mistakes could kill everyone aboard. The airline captain came on frequency after what seemed like an eternity but was actually only 12 minutes, his voice calm and professional as he introduced himself as Captain Michael Foster, a Czech airman and senior instructor with 25 years of experience flying 737 aircraft. He told Emma that he had been briefed on the situation and that she should know that what she had already done was extraordinarily courageous and exactly correct, that shutting down the contaminated bleed air and getting oxygen flowing to the incapacitated pilots had probably saved everyone aboard. Emma felt tears threatening at the kind words but forced them back, knowing that she needed to maintain complete focus for whatever came next. Captain Foster asked Emma to describe her exact level of knowledge and experience, and she explained about her parents and the simulator training they had given her, about the thousands of hours she had spent studying procedures and flying simulated scenarios including emergencies far worse than what they currently faced. Captain Foster made a decision to trust this young girl's claimed expertise because he had no viable alternative, and he began to methodically assess her understanding of aircraft systems and procedures through targeted questions. He asked Emma to describe the function of various instruments and controls, to explain how the autothrottle system worked, to identify the warnings currently displayed and explain what they indicated about aircraft status. Emma answered every question correctly and with technical precision that convinced Foster she genuinely possessed the knowledge she claimed, though both of them understood that knowing procedures intellectually and executing them under real-world pressure with lives at stake were entirely different challenges. Foster told Emma that they were going to work together as a team, that he would guide her through every step of what needed to happen, and that she should not hesitate to ask questions or admit if anything was unclear because clarity was far more important than appearing knowledgeable. The first critical decision involved selecting an airport for emergency landing, and Foster explained the factors they needed to consider including weather, runway length, emergency response capabilities, and the aircraft's current position and fuel state. Emma pulled up the route map on the flight management computer and they discussed several options including Great Falls, Montana and Spokane, Washington, with Foster ultimately recommending Spokane because it had better weather, longer runways, and more extensive emergency response resources. Emma acknowledged the decision and asked whether she should reprogram the flight management computer now or wait until they were closer, and Foster told her to wait because the incapacitated pilots might wake up before landing became necessary. He explained that engine oil contamination in bleed air could render pilots unconscious for anywhere from minutes to hours depending on exposure levels, and there remained hope that Reynolds or Chen might regain consciousness in time to take over the landing. Sarah remained in the cockpit monitoring the unconscious pilots while passengers in the cabin struggled with the surreal reality of their situation, some praying quietly and others simply sitting in stunned silence. The private pilot who had identified himself earlier stood in the cockpit doorway offering to help however he could, and Emma asked him to monitor Captain Reynolds and First Officer Chen for any signs of consciousness while she focused on managing the aircraft systems. Time seemed to stretch strangely as Flight 782 continued its northwest track with a 12-year-old girl now effectively serving as the only conscious pilot aboard, her small hands resting on the control panel while her eyes continuously scanned instruments exactly as her father had taught her. Captain Foster maintained constant radio contact, his voice providing reassurance and expertise that gave Emma confidence she could actually accomplish what seemed impossible. When they were about 80 miles southeast of Spokane, Captain Foster told Emma it was time to begin preparing for the approach and landing, and he would guide her through the process step by step. Emma acknowledged and carefully unlocked the flight management computer's interface, her fingers hovering over the keys as Foster dictated exactly what entries she needed to make. She programmed the computer to fly to Spokane International Airport, selected the ILS approach to runway 03 which Foster recommended because of its favorable wind conditions, and loaded the approach procedures that would guide them down to the runway. Each entry required confirmation of multiple data fields, and Emma worked methodically through the process while reading back every entry to Foster, who verified she had programmed everything correctly. She felt sweat trickling down her back despite the cool cockpit temperature, her breathing shallow and rapid as the magnitude of what she was attempting became increasingly real. Foster talked Emma through calculating the approach speed and landing configuration they would need, explaining that she should use the lightest possible landing weight from the performance tables even though their actual weight was higher, because landing fast was far better than landing slow and potentially stalling the aircraft. Emma found the relevant pages in the quick reference handbook and calculated that they should cross the runway threshold at approximately 140 knots, which felt impossibly fast to her even though she had flown hundreds of simulator approaches at similar speeds. Foster then addressed the most critical question of whether Emma should attempt to manually fly the approach or allow the autopilot to conduct an automatic landing, explaining that modern 737 aircraft had autoland capability that could fly the approach and touchdown without pilot input as long as certain conditions were met. Emma checked the instrument panel and confirmed that their aircraft had the required equipment and that the runway at Spokane had the necessary ground systems to support an autoland approach. The decision to use autoland meant that Emma would not actually need to hand-fly the approach, instead monitoring the autopilot and ensuring it performed correctly while managing the landing gear, flaps, and other systems at appropriate points during the descent. This significantly reduced the complexity of what Emma needed to accomplish, though Foster emphasized that she would need to maintain constant vigilance and be prepared to execute a go-around if anything went wrong during the approach. He walked her through the go-around procedure step by step, explaining that if she needed to abort the landing she should simply push the go-around buttons on the throttle levers and the aircraft would automatically pitch up and climb while she ensured the landing gear retracted and the engines went to full power. Emma memorized the procedure and rehearsed it several times, knowing that in an actual emergency situation she might have only seconds to react correctly. As Flight 782 began its descent toward Spokane under the autopilot's control, Emma started working through the approach checklist with Foster's guidance, configuring the aircraft exactly as required for landing. She extended the landing gear at the appropriate altitude and felt the aircraft shudder slightly as the wheels dropped into the airstream, the gear indicators on the instrument panel showing 3 green lights that confirmed all landing gear had extended and locked properly. She selected approach flaps in stages as they descended, watching the airspeed carefully and ensuring it remained within the proper range for each flap setting. Emergency vehicles were already stationed along the runway at Spokane, firefighters and paramedics prepared for the possibility that this unprecedented landing might end in disaster, though everyone involved hoped desperately that the 12-year-old girl now flying the aircraft could somehow bring everyone home safely. Captain Reynolds stirred in his seat as they descended through 10,000 feet, his eyes fluttering open briefly before closing again as consciousness remained frustratingly elusive. Sarah immediately reported the movement to Emma, who relayed it to Captain Foster, and everyone felt a surge of hope that Reynolds might wake up in time to take over the landing. But as the aircraft continued descending through 8,000 feet and then 6,000 feet, Reynolds showed no further signs of waking and Emma accepted that she would need to see this landing through to completion. Foster's voice remained steady and encouraging as he talked her through each stage of the approach, telling her that she was doing everything exactly right and that thousands of pilots had conducted this same approach successfully and she would too. Emma tried to believe him while fighting the terror that kept threatening to overwhelm her focus, reminding herself that her parents had trained her for exactly this scenario even though they could never have imagined she would need to use that training to save her own life and the lives of 163 other passengers and crew. The instrument landing system needles centered as Flight 782 intercepted the final approach course, and the autopilot began following the electronic guidance that would lead them down a precise 3-degree glide path to the runway threshold. Emma watched the needles intently while monitoring airspeed and altitude, calling out her readings to Captain Foster, who confirmed that everything looked exactly as it should. The aircraft descended through 4,000 feet and then 3,000 feet, the ground rising up to meet them as buildings and roads became visible through the cockpit windows. Emma could see the runway ahead in the distance, a long ribbon of concrete that looked impossibly narrow from her current altitude, and she tried not to think about the fact that in just a few minutes she would need to ensure this massive machine touched down smoothly on that narrow strip without killing everyone aboard. Foster talked Emma through arming the auto brake system for landing, explaining that the automatic brakes would activate upon touchdown to help slow the aircraft without requiring her to manually apply brake pressure. He told her that after landing she should keep her hands off the controls and allow the auto brake system to do its job, that the aircraft would slow to taxi speed automatically and she should then apply manual braking only if needed to complete the stop. Emma acknowledged each instruction while continuing to monitor the approach, her eyes darting between the flight instruments and the view outside as the runway grew larger in front of them. Sarah stood behind the captain's seat with one hand gripping the seat back for support, watching this child perform actions that seemed to belong in some impossible dream rather than actual reality. The radio altimeter counted down their height above the ground as they descended through 1,000 feet, then 500 feet, the calm automated voice calling, 500, while the runway now filled the windscreen ahead of them. Emma's hands gripped the sides of her seat as the autopilot maintained perfect control, keeping the wings level and the nose positioned exactly on the proper glide slope while the autothrottle managed engine power with computer precision. Foster told Emma that she was seconds from touchdown and to keep monitoring the instruments, that the autopilot would flare the aircraft automatically just before landing, pulling the nose up slightly to reduce the descent rate and ensure a smooth touchdown. Emma watched the radio altimeter wind down through 100 feet, then 50 feet, the ground rushing up now as buildings and terrain streaked past the windows in a blur of motion that made her stomach clench with raw fear. The automated voice called 40, and then 30, and Emma saw the runway threshold pass beneath them, the gray concrete now filling her entire field of vision as they floated just feet above the surface. The autopilot executed the automatic flare exactly as programmed, raising the nose slightly as power reduced and the aircraft settled onto the runway with a surprisingly gentle chirp as the main wheels contacted concrete. Emma felt the touchdown through her seat and heard the auto brake system activate immediately, the whoosh of brake actuation and the roar of reverse thrust as the engines automatically deployed thrust reversers to help slow their momentum. The aircraft decelerated rapidly while tracking straight down the centerline, and Emma kept her hands clear of the controls exactly as Foster had instructed, allowing the automated systems to complete the landing roll without interference. Flight 782 slowed through 60 knots and then 40 knots as emergency vehicles raced alongside the runway keeping pace with their progress, and finally rolled to a complete stop about halfway down the runway's length. Emma sat frozen in the captain's seat for several seconds, her mind struggling to process that they had actually landed safely, that everyone was alive, that she had somehow accomplished what should have been impossible for someone her age. Captain Foster's voice came over the radio congratulating her on a perfect landing and telling her that she had just done something remarkable that would be discussed in aviation circles for decades to come. Sarah burst into tears and wrapped her arms around Emma from behind, holding the young girl tightly while her own body shook with relief and residual terror from what they had just experienced. Emergency crews swarmed the aircraft immediately, paramedics rushing aboard to assess and treat the still unconscious pilots while fire crews stood ready to handle any emergency that might develop. Captain Reynolds and First Officer Chen were carefully removed from the cockpit on stretchers and rushed to waiting ambulances, their prognosis uncertain but their vital signs stable. Emma climbed down from the captain's seat on shaking legs, her body trembling with the adrenaline crash that followed the most intense 2 hours of her life. She had saved 164 people through knowledge and courage that defied every reasonable expectation, and now she stood in the cockpit feeling impossibly small and young and completely overwhelmed by what had just occurred. The passengers deplaned through mobile stairs positioned at the forward and rear doors, many of them stopping to look at Emma with expressions of awe and gratitude that made her uncomfortable. Several people tried to hug her or shake her hand, thanking her for saving their lives with tears streaming down their faces, and Emma accepted their gratitude with quiet embarrassment while mostly wishing she could disappear. The businessman from the exit row who had argued about market share now knelt down to Emma's eye level and told her that he had a daughter her age, and he could not imagine his child having the courage and skill to do what Emma had just accomplished. The young couple heading to Seattle for vacation both hugged her simultaneously while crying, and the elderly man who had slept through most of the flight gripped her hand and told her she was the bravest person he had ever met in his 87 years of life. Sarah stayed close to Emma as airline officials and airport authorities began arriving to assess the situation and document what had occurred, and Emma found herself suddenly the center of attention from people who wanted detailed accounts of every action she had taken and every decision she had made. An FAA inspector arrived within 30 minutes and spoke extensively with Emma while recording her statement, his expression shifting between disbelief and admiration as she described the sequence of events from the moment she realized both pilots were incapacitated. He asked technical questions about her training and knowledge, clearly trying to understand how someone her age could possibly have possessed the expertise necessary to safely operate a commercial jet aircraft, and Emma explained about her parents and the years of instruction they had provided before their deaths. Captain Michael Foster arrived at Spokane Airport 2 hours later, having immediately boarded a flight from his base in Seattle when he learned that the child he had talked through the landing had succeeded. He found Emma in an airport office being interviewed by yet another investigator, and he waited patiently until they finished before introducing himself in person. Foster was a tall man in his 50s with graying hair and kind eyes that crinkled when he smiled, and he shook Emma's hand with genuine respect while telling her that in his entire career he had never witnessed anything as extraordinary as what she had accomplished today. He said that her parents would have been incredibly proud of her, that the training they had given her had not only honored their memory but had saved lives in ways they could never have anticipated. The investigation into Flight 782's emergency would take months as the National Transportation Safety Board worked to determine the exact cause of the bleed air contamination and identify the maintenance failures that had allowed the situation to develop. Captain Reynolds and First Officer Chen both recovered fully after being treated for carbon monoxide poisoning and chemical exposure from contaminated engine oil, with no lasting effects from their ordeal beyond the psychological trauma of knowing they had been unconscious while a 12-year-old child saved their aircraft. Both pilots made a point of meeting with Emma once they recovered, thanking her for actions that had preserved not only their lives but their professional reputations, since the emergency had resulted from mechanical failure rather than any crew error. Reynolds told Emma that she had demonstrated airmanship that would have been impressive in a veteran pilot and was simply remarkable coming from someone her age, and he encouraged her to pursue aviation professionally when she was old enough to seek her pilot certificates. The story of Flight 782 dominated news coverage for weeks as the unprecedented nature of the event captured public imagination worldwide, and Emma found herself thrust into an unwanted spotlight that she struggled to manage. News crews camped outside her grandmother's house seeking interviews, and Emma gave only one press conference at the airline's request before refusing all further media appearances. She spoke simply and directly about what had occurred, crediting her parents for the training that had made her actions possible and emphasizing that she had only done what anyone in her position would have done when faced with no alternative. The humility and grace she demonstrated while handling the intense public attention only increased the admiration people felt for her, with many commenting that her maturity and character were as remarkable as her technical aviation knowledge. The airline created a special scholarship program in Emma's name to support aviation education for young people, and several major flight training organizations offered her free instruction toward her pilot certificates once she reached the minimum age requirements. The FAA granted Emma an exceptional recognition for her actions while also carefully noting that her emergency operation of the aircraft did not constitute any violation of regulations since she had acted to preserve life in a genuine emergency where no certificated pilots were available. Emma returned to her regular life in Seattle with her grandmother, going back to school where she was simultaneously treated as a celebrity by some classmates and just another student by others who did not fully understand what had occurred. She continued her aviation studies with renewed dedication, knowing now that the theoretical knowledge she had accumulated could translate into real-world actions when circumstances demanded. Captain Foster became a mentor to Emma, staying in regular contact and providing guidance as she navigated the complex path toward professional aviation certification. Flight 782 became a permanent part of aviation history and safety education, studied in pilot training programs and discussed in books and documentaries about remarkable events in commercial aviation. The story reminded the aviation world that emergencies could occur despite the most careful planning and preparation, and that safety resulted from multiple layers of protection including maintenance, training, procedures, and the human capacity to respond creatively when established systems failed. Emma's actions had saved 164 people not through superhuman abilities but through knowledge, preparation, and the courage to act when action was required. Her parents had given her the tools she needed without knowing she would ever need to use them in such dramatic fashion, and their legacy lived on through the lives saved and the safety lessons learned from their daughter's remarkable response to an impossible situation.